So we'll take questions now.
Hi, Mark Brown from The Guardian. Most organisations seem to have been encouraged to apply for sort of standstill budgets, as it were. I mean, is there a sense, or is there a fear that you might be almost restricting ambition?
Well, yes, I think the first point to make there, every single MPO that's either joining or existing in the portfolio represents an investment in new ideas, new productions, new exhibitions. So every funded organisation is ambitious and will be creating great new work. So you have to look at the whole portfolio. The fact that it is relatively the same number of organisations in it, and many are getting relatively the same funding, which we've managed to achieve, which we're pleased about, doesn't mean there's any limit on ambition. Quite the reverse. It represents a sizable investment in ambition.
Richard Morrison from The Times. Could you just elaborate on your discussions with English National Opera, because you've cut their grant by 33%, and you say here that you suggested to them they reduce their performances, but they are not going to do that. So what other plan have they put forward to cope with that?
Well, I'll answer this as Basil on the board of English National Opera. We did some analysis that came up with a planning figure for them. And our analysis, as you say, suggested reduced level of performances. They've come back to us saying that they have an alternative plan, which we are discussing with them, because whatever happens, the plan that they follow has to be theirs. It has to be their artistic plan. They have to believe in it, and they have to want to do it. So what we're doing now is we're discussing with them what their business plan will be, what the funding agreement will be, based on this number that we've given them today, together with transition funding to get from one model to another. Because it was clear to both parties, as it were, that the current business model is under strain in many directions, and something had to be done.
Lynn Gardner, The Guardian. Alan, you mentioned that the partner museums, twice you mentioned that it very much improved the geographical spread, yes. So if we're talking about a shift of only 2% from 2012 to from 51% to 53% of funding out of London, how much do those partner museums account for? What percentage do they account for in that?
In the 53% figure, that's only the arts organisations, the national portfolio organisations. If you look at the major partner museums, 9% of the spending is in London and 91% is outside London. I mean, the funding for major partner museums has been set up on a different basis, but they're not part of the 53 figure.
Hello, Jack Mulvin from The Times. I don't want to make out that The Times is obsessed with English National Opera, but it's a question about them too. You there was essentially one-off funding in 2003 and 2006. There was Catalyst funding, I think, last year, and now you're giving them another one-off of £7.6 million. At what point does these one-off things become a series of regular funds?
Well, I mean, in a way, what you're saying is why we undertook the opera and ballet analysis, because we had put money, extra money into over a number of years. But what we've agreed with them now is we both agree that the business model is under such stress that it needs to be rethought, and this transition funding is to get them specifically to a new business model. So this is the previous injects of cash were trying to make the previous business model work, and I think now we've seen that we couldn't do that, so we're moving to a new business model, and that's what's different about this one.
Are you making an ultimatum? Is this the last?
Well, we'll see how. Look, we're going to have discussions with them on how this will work. We're not in the business of ultimatums.
Jack Hutchinson, AN, the Artists Information Company. I just wondered how much and to what extent the fair payment of artists has been built into these agreements, and how this will be evaluated.
Well, when we negotiate our funding agreements with the companies we're funding, fair pay for artists is part of that agreement that we reach with them. And that's one of the requirements we make of them. And we'll be monitoring that.
Rupert Christensen, The Telegraph. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the organisations which have been dropped from the portfolio. Do they have a right to appeal? And will you ever publish a list of which ones they are?
Can I take that one? Oh, me. Organisations not in the portfolio could be for a number of reasons. I mean, some might have applied and haven't been successful. Some didn't apply. If the organisation itself kind of comes out and says, you know, we were unsuccessful, then we can talk a bit more openly about it. In terms of appeals, people can complain about the way the decision was made. And last time we had something like 8 cases, I think, where that was pursued. So that's open for them to do so.
Were any of them upheld? Grants were stored?
One was, yes, and I can't remember which one it was now, but one was, yes. So there is a complaints process.
So there is a complaints process. That happens over 6 months, 3 months?
I think people have about 6 months within which to lodge a complaint. And then the complaint takes as long as it takes, because it goes to one level, which is internal, and then it goes external, if needs be.
Just to give you a sense of the scale, Rupert, just to give you a sense of the scale, last time the NPO portfolio came down from about 850 to 696. This time there are 58 levers, so this is a much less dramatic reshaping of the portfolio than we've had in the past.
Yeah. And sorry, one last point. Would it be fair to say that all these organisations which have dropped are small organisations? There's no major organisation that you fund to the tune of over £1 million, which has been dropped? No. Yeah. Thank you.
That mic to Simon.
Hi, thanks. Simon Tate, Arts Industry. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about the strategic funding and where the funds have been cut. You mentioned there's increased funding in some elements, but you didn't mention any place where the cuts are being made.
Well, I think we both mentioned that capital spending will be considerably lower in the period. Secondly, there's less money for catalyst endowment schemes. And thirdly...
Can you say how much less for catalyst endowment?
I think it's laid out, isn't it?
It's all laid out.
It's laid out in your briefing document. And thirdly, I think, Alan, you'd probably touch on one or two other elements that have been reduced.
I mean, there's actually no money for catalyst endowment funds, but there's money for catalyst. Capital is down to about just below 30 million now. It's currently about 50 million, so that's an example. There's slightly less money in strategic funding, but there's still considerable funding at £23 million a year. There's less money for building digital capacity, but again, there's still a considerable amount. Catalyst endowments is the major thing that we can't do this time around.
I mean, is this an indication that you don't think that philanthropy is working?
No, not at all. Not at all. But what we do know is that the wider Catalyst scheme, the match funding and the capacity building all around the country has been the most valuable part of the Catalyst armoury of interventions, and we're anxious to continue that.
A couple of points, Simon, on fundraising. There are a number of initiatives supporting fundraising, including yesterday morning I was at 65 graduates applying for 10 fellowship places for the new fellowship course that Cause 4 are running for us, which is designed to start, and it's a second year of operation, designed to create a new cadre of professional fundraisers in arts and culture. And you'll see in the annual report that we place on the public record in a few months' time that actually arts and cultural organisations between 2012, 13 and 13, 14 have actually put up their fundraising. So there is evidence of advances in that area, and we'll continue to support various initiatives. It's just at what level.
Okay, one from Nick.
Hi, Nick Clark from The Independent. I've got a couple of questions. The first is of the companies that have, of the arts organisations that have left, do we know how many didn't reapply and how many were rejected? And in terms of funding, it's just very simple. With all of the different revenue streams, all of that, just how much less is available to the arts this time around?
Across all funding streams? Well, it's because we cut them, it's probably around, it's more than 50 million. But remember, we're dealing with cumulative cuts since 2010. So it's hard to kind of, we'll give you the best number we can that kind of summarises that after, I think. And what was the other part of your question, sorry?
It was about how many of the organisations that are leaving, how many were rejected and how many didn't reapply?
16 didn't apply, so the rest weren't successful.
It might help you, by the way, to know, after the last MPO round, when there were approximately 700 MPOs put in the portfolio, there were 1,300 applicants for those 700 places. We monitored the 600 unsuccessful applicants. 2 years afterwards, 400 of them were still in operation. And very often, people who cease to be an MPO will make an application to grants for the arts, and sometimes it's more appropriate for them and the size of organisation they are. So there are multiple approaches. Rupert was also asking about organisations leaving the MPO portfolio. There are multiple approaches to funding. It doesn't necessarily mean they stop being funded by the Arts Council.
So what we found last time was that lots of them got grants for the arts and negotiated that quite quickly. And if you look at the portfolio this time, there are some organisations that left the portfolio a few years ago that are back now, and Derby Theatre being one example, and the Northcote.
Sorry, can you repeat that number? How many organisations were?
Yeah, we monitored it 2 years afterwards, and of the 600 unsuccessful applicants to be an MPO, 400 were still in existence, were still in operation.
Have we got any more? Yes.
Simon Stevens, Museums Journal. Were the rebalancing our cultural capital and the place reports the kind of impetus for driving more money into the regions?
Can I answer that? Because I'm a relative newcomer to the Arts Council, and the first question I asked sometime before those two reports were published was, what are we doing about funding of arts outside London, where it's much more difficult to raise funding and where people rely more on local authority funding? So it was an early priority of mine, and what I discovered was that Alan and his executive colleagues had already been working hard on strategies to do with funding of arts outside London. An example would be the analysis they did after the last MPO round to look at where the cold spots were, where there'd been fewer applications, and to create the Creative People and Places Fund in order to raise capacity, raise the number of applications from those areas. So there have been a number of initiatives in place, but I do think that those two reports, not that I agree with every single recommendation in them, but I do think those two reports have been positive and helpful because I think they've allowed all of us to focus on a very important issue, and I think encouraged us to come up with further ideas, like the Regional Talent Fund, the Regional Ambition Fund that Alan mentioned this morning, which I've just misnamed. So I think it's been a very healthy and valuable and positive debate.
Yeah, James.
James Pickford from the Financial Times. You've raised fears in the past that the loss of local authority funding would lead to the Arts Council being unable to sustain those organisations just from its own resources. Are there any instances of substantial cuts here, or complete cuts, which have been caused by local authority cuts themselves?
I'll start the answer and let Alan finish it. I mean, the first point is there are a number of successful MPO applications which depend on co-funding by local authorities, and that's part of their application, and that's part of our understanding of the robustness of their plan. So there are a number of applications that have been successful because local authorities are partners in it, and they would not have been successful otherwise. So that's the first part of the answer. But you ask, are there any specific examples?
Well, there are no specific examples, but what I'd say is that the extent to which we've maintained funding across the portfolio gives us a really good starting point in which to build partnerships with local authorities. So we can say, and arts organisations can say, we've got this guarantee of funding from the Arts Council. It's a vote of confidence. It's a solid investment. And then, therefore, that puts the conversation with local government on a better footing because they're interested in the money that's coming into their local area. But I've described this as kind of a constant kind of arm wrestling match, if you like, in that we have to do it on a case-by-case basis with local authority by local authority, and it's difficult to generalise.
few more minutes. Who's got any? Yep.
Nicola from the stage. I was just wondering, looking at the numbers of your organisations that are in the portfolio that are BME-led or disability-led, they've gone down, and I wondered how that plays into your strategy for trying to increase diversity into the arts. How does that work?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I explained that this was the first time we'd asked organisations in applying to say how they'll contribute and put into their own organisation the creative case for diversity. And I said we'll hold them to that and monitor that, and it'll be part of their funding agreement going forward. But it is true that BME-led and diversity-led organisations, the numbers have gone down this time. Those are defined by our long-standing definition of their workforce and governance being more than 51% having BME characteristics or disability characteristics. And if you think about it, that actually leaves out lots of organisations that are led by some of our most talented BME leaders, actually. So in the fullness of time, that definition is probably becoming less useful to us. But what we need to do is to make sure that we build in diversity and an awareness and a determination to do something about diversity throughout the whole system. And that's what the creative case and our requiring organisations to tell us what they're going to do in respect to the creative case comes in. So I think in the long term, that's going to be more effective. We've got this. In terms of losing those organisations, we've lost something like 2.4 million over the 3 years of the portfolio from the portfolio. We're putting in £6 million of strategic funds in order to undertake a range of activities, such as commissioning, building on the Unlimited programme, for example, and such as having change agents kind of within MPOs to build capacity and engage more effectively. So I think what we're trying to do is move to embedding more deep-rooted change, I think, that will have a much more lasting effect and actually lead to better art, and that's the heart of the creative case for diversity.
I'd just like to add one more thing to Alan's point about the current measurements not really indicating the true picture, which is that although we have a long way to go, because we have a long way to go across the country in these respects, we do monitor employment in our funded arts and cultural organisations. And at the moment, the figure is about 13% for BME employees. The national makeup of population is 15%. You'll have read quite a lot about the broadcasting industry recently and a lot of coverage of their position. The relevant figure there is 6%. So arts and cultural organisations are doing a lot better than some other parts of the creative sector, but we still have a long way to go.
Yeah. Come back to you,
Frances
Simon.
Richards, arts professional. We're aware that a number of organisations received emergency funds in the last 3 years, and I was just wondering how many of those have been readmitted as MPOs?
I can't give a number off the top of my head, but where we have given people emergency funds, it's because they're usually a strategically important organisation, one whose loss to the cultural makeup of the country would be a serious thing, and one where we can, and this has been true of the last few years, where an intervention can actually make a difference, and we address whatever structural problems and difficulties we've identified in those particular companies. I think those intervention funds and our ability to make interventions like that are very important, because when we set off with this portfolio next year, that's year one, things can change rapidly in 3 years. So the amount of money and the way an organisation's running in year one might have changed by year 3. And so we have to be ready to make interventions where necessary, because things change, other funders drop out, pressures might arise because of the way the tickets sell or whatever. And as an Arts Council, we have a responsibility to make sure that arts organisations can succeed.
Simon.
Simon Tate, Arts Industry. You mentioned, Baz, that you're going to move out of the cauldron that is Westminster into the serenity that is Bloomsbury in a couple of weeks. saving
I
a
wish
million...
I'd put it as eloquently as that.
saving £1 million a year, that presumably is £1 million that would come back into the arts budget.
Yeah, the whole, I mean, it's before my time, Simon, but the whole point of the way the Arts Council responded to the 30% cut it got in 2010 was to, as you know, cut its staffing from about 550 to about 420, to reorganise itself into 5 areas, and indeed to save money on its property portfolio. It's all part of that response, which has, in effect, meant that although the Arts Council was cut by 30%, at that time, and I'm talking history now, arts organisations were only cut by 15%. So it was a way of putting more money on the front line, if you like.
Well, you were cut by 50%, in fact, weren't you?
Our admin from government was cut by 50%.
But overall, the Arts Council was cut by...
But that £1 million saving, that is your saving. That's not the government's saving. That's not what they're saving on the rent and so forth. It's what that saving is yours.
That is an economy made in the running of this organisation, so that historically the Arts Council's costs as a percentage of its revenue would have been hovering around 10% some years ago. That figure is now 5%, and I think compares well with most organisations.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Will, so...
Hi, just a quick question. On the 58 organisations which have been cut from the portfolio, what's the split between regional and London?
We can certainly
Don't know the
tell you
figure
that.
off the top of my head.
We can certainly tell you that. We'll tell you that right afterwards, Will.
Yeah.
Can we work that out, guys, for Will? Yeah? Thanks.
Do you have any more questions? We do need to wrap up now. Okay, one more from Jack.
Very boring technical question. I don't imagine anyone wants to. Has there been a change in the way that councils are funding? Are you funding councils directly in a way that you weren't before? Because I see that Southampton Council has had a 265% increase in funding. I don't know if there's an interesting answer to that, whether it's just a technical reallocation.
It goes to specific organisations, but it's that the council kind of is running that organisation, as it were.
In the case of Southampton, it's SNAC, which is a new capital building in Southampton.
In the case of East Lindsey, they run the Soul Festival in Skegness.
Right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Break up now.